Hi, my name is Suchith, Tissera, former debater at Royal College and the current head coach at Trinity College. In this video, I'll be discussing the motion this House would give unions a veto over political appointments made in their field. So basically, I'll be doing three things. First, I'll be talking about proposition and the setup for proposition and the content related to proposition. Secondly, I'll basically be talking about opposition setup and content, and finally I'll be giving a general idea on what the clashes could look like in most debates. So firstly, on proposition, a few things on in context, but I don't think you need to specifically explain context very explicitly. So that means because it's very straightforward in this motion, you don't need to put a lot of effort into framing. But I think the most important thing related to context is to make sure that your model is very thought out. So a few things that I would say within model, firstly, is to make sure you know exactly what this veto system is likely to look like. So it can be that you veto out a singular individual based on the fact that the union feels like that person isn't fit to be in that particular position of power. The second thing you need to make sure is you need to have a checking mechanism to make sure that the union doesn't veto out people who might be people who are fit for this particular position. So what I would suggest is something like having and making sure that these unions put out a report as to why exactly they vetoed out a certain individual after they veto them out. So this report would have content as to what exactly the reasoning behind the vetoing was. What this does, it doesn't completely mitigate the fact that they can veto out a certain person for no reason, but at least it has a certain amount of check and balance to make sure that they can't just necessarily use this veto power for their own political gain. But the final thing is to have this idea of making sure that the veto system is likely to be electoral. That is to say, you have within this particular union, there's going to be an election or at least a certain amount of votes being carried out to make sure that the person you veto is someone that most people want to veto as well, because what is likely to happen is proposition can push the idea that most unions aren't likely to be very democratic, and it's like to be very top heavy in most cases, right? So then moving on to the content that proposition can run. So the first, I think, the idea that you need to run is the idea related to the principle. Even though opposition's principle is much stronger, proposition still needs to run a principle idea to mitigate the principle by opposition, right? So the first thing I would say on principle is to talk about why exactly the people within these unions and the workers within this industry need to have a say when it comes to who is chosen as the political figure in this industry. So the reason for that, you can say, is because those are the people who are most affected by whoever is elected from the parliament of whoever is elected by the government, right? So in that instance, they need to be at least a part of the representative body or the electoral body for the appointment, because they will be affected greatly. Because at the point in which you don't give them a say in who is going to be elected, that is when you elect someone that they might not be able to work with, and that's going to harm them in the long run anyway, because it's going to make sure that the relationship between the political figure in control and the workers in that industry don't really meet eye to eye, and that's uniquely problematic. So principally, that's one idea you can run. But the second idea, because of the fact in most cases the principle is hard to win on proposition, is to say that look, the principle is important, but the fact still remains that if you prove practical harm of the current regime and the current system, and prove why practically it's beneficial to have a system in which you have these particular unions with a certain amount of power, that's going to be uniquely beneficial, then it doesn't necessarily matter if it's not going to be principally right. If on a utilitarian basis you have more beneficial impacts on proposition's world. But then moving on to the practical benefits, right? The first practical benefit is very straightforward. It's the fact that, oh look, you're going to have a person who is unlikely to be as corrupt as the current person who's likely to get into power. So you're able to at least mitigate certain amount of harms that can happen at the point in which you elect the most corrupt individual. So you can mitigate it by making sure you veto out that kind of person. But the second, I think, the extension to this is as to why exactly people on the middle ground are likely to now want to support and work with these with these unions. The reason for this is now the unions have power. Currently in status quo, unions don't necessarily have a lot of power, so like most political figures don't really want to do anything with the union. So that really causes a divide between the union and the political figures. But now what's going to happen on props world is the unions will have power, so they need to have a certain amount of say. When they do have a certain amount of say, that is when most political figures want to work with these people, because they know if they don't work with them or they have a bad reputation, they can get vetoed out. So in that instance, it's going to have a better, more symbiotic relationship. But that necessarily means is two things. One, you're going to have a certain amount of checks and balances. That's likely to mean that the most like corrupt individuals get weeded out. And the second thing is you're likely to see that people who are better suited for these roles are likely to get it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a completely self-righteous and like someone who is selfless completely, but that it's likely to still mean you're going to have an individual who is less as corrupt as whoever might have come if you don't have this veto system. The third thing I want to discuss is the idea that more cooperation leads to better benefits. That is to say, as I mentioned in the principal idea, it's the workers and those individuals in the unions that are the people who work with these political figures. When the relationship between the political figure and the union and the workers are far better, that means you're going to have better outcomes in the industry, because you're going to be more efficient and you're going to see eye to eye. That leads to better outcomes within the industry, leading to better benefits for the people as a whole. So it's going to be beneficial for the general public, and that's an extension of the idea of cooperation. The final thing then on proposition that you can run is the idea on how workers are likely to be more motivated and unlikely to be as apathetic as they are currently. Why are people right now very apathetic? It's because of the fact that most workers feel like their voices aren't being heard in the current system of politics, where they don't have like the ability to make sure that their voices are heard through the union, because the unions doesn't have any power. At the point in which now the unions do have a certain amount of power and a certain amount of say, that is when now workers are also going to feel like, oh, unions who are an extension of themselves now have power, therefore I should also get more motivated and work hard. So the idea of hopelessness and like apathy that exists currently is unlikely to be as prevalent in propositions. So workers are likely to be more likely to work harder, so it's going to be more beneficial in that industry as a whole, right? So then moving on to like uplines that opposition can run. I don't think there's a complete recontextualization that opposition needs to do. However, a few important things on setup that opposition can do is mitigate a lot of the harms on mitigate a lot of the benefits on props world by pointing holes in the props model. In most cases, in most debates, the problem that's likely to happen is proposition won't set up the debate very well. So opposition can utilize this and make sure to show why exactly that giving unions power means that these unions are going to utilize this power greatly, and make sure that they don't have any checking mechanisms to make sure that the unions use this power in a manner that is not self-interested. The second thing they can say is, oh look, even if you veto out a singular person, that doesn't necessarily mean that like all the bad apples in the world are going to be removed, right? You're still going to have individuals who are bad, who might get into power even if you don't get the worst of the worst people in. So the efficacy of the system essentially can be put into question on opposition. But secondly then on like the argumentation that can be run on opposition, I think the most important argument that you can run on opposition on is on principle, and prove why the principle is uniquely problematic. So I think the biggest idea here is as to why exactly on principle why it's not democratic to let these individuals into the appointment of political figures. The reason for this is currently the government and the state are the people who choose who the political figures appointed are, and the government is an extension of the people because they are voted in by the people. Sure, in some instances the government is corrupt, but there's a lot of checking mechanisms that the government does have to make sure that the worst forms of corruption is unlikely to happen, and the worst forms of self-interest is unlikely to happen. The forms of like self-interest that are unlikely to happen can be mitigated by things like having an opposition party, things like making sure that you get removed or impeached to the point in which you are like exposed of corruption, having like non-conventional media outlets like social media, and for example making sure that like your name gets thrown in the mud. And finally, like even conventional media outlets making sure that you put them in the paper, oh look, this person is corrupt, and like just propagating more like information. Because I think currently within how society works, where people are more aware and have more circulation of information, it's very hard for individuals to have a good reputation if they are corrupt. That is why the government like is likely to be hurt at the point in which they are explicitly corrupt to a great degree. So at that point, then you prove that, oh look, the state is the best actor because the state was elected by the people and they are a representative of the people, and their responsibilities are aligned with the people. Sure, they might be partially self-interested, but that self-interest is there, but it's even greater on propositions world. Why? Because the individuals in the unions are now being given power, and these individuals aren't elected bodies, right? So these people are individuals who are just part of a union that is unofficial. So they have no intention or no responsibility to the general public at all. Their responsibilities align with the people within the union or themselves, right? So then the problem then becomes that they won't carry out their actions for the best interests of the people or the general public, and much rather just themselves and the people within their union as a whole. So the unique harm of that is going to be that there's no representative, and there's going to be individuals who aren't representatives of the general public going to get more power than is necessary, and that's uniquely problematic and just principally unjustified because it's not democratic at all. The second thing you can run is the idea that, oh look, these unions are problematic as a whole, as a concept. The reason is because within these unions, it's most likely than not people from high economic standards and high like social classes who control the vast majority of these unions. And there's a vast distinction between those people and the vast majority of individuals within this union who are from like lower economic standard and lower social classes. In the vast majority, then at the point in which you have this power given to the unions, what's likely than not to happen is these people at the top are likely to take control and use this veto power for themselves. That is to say, elect individuals or increase the probability of electing individuals that might be beneficial for them as a leader of a union, which might not necessarily mean it's going to be beneficial for the union as a whole and just for the top class people within that union. So irrespective of whether or not the union gets power to elect individuals or choose to elect individuals whoever they want, you can mitigate all of this by saying, oh look, the individuals that they elect isn't really going to help the majority of workers anyway, because these unions are uniquely problematic. So that mitigates a lot of the benefits that proposition can run by saying that unions inherently are bad actors. And the third thing you can say is how exactly that these unions in most cases are going to elect individuals who might have narrow plans of action. These narrow plans of action might not necessarily help the general public. That is to say, a political appointment by the state is aligned with the state's intention of helping the general public, which is the state's biggest intention, right? However, these unions' biggest intention is to make sure that their selfish goals are met and the union's goals are met. This distinction looks like basically how these appointments might actually focus on making sure that these unions get better pay and stuff like that, or things like getting them leave and getting them like all of these kind of reduction in all of the problems that they might have, that might not directly compensate and directly help the society as a whole, where they might get better compensation, but that compensation might not lead to like efficiency and all of that stuff. And that's uniquely problematic because that kind of narrow goals where only helping the union isn't likely to get any benefits for society as a whole. The final thing then, the two final things actually, the first of which is like the idea that, look, if you have an individual who is appointed who might not be the best actor for the state, it's unlikely that the parliament and other representatives of the government are likely to align with this particular appointed figure who is appointed based on the alliance of the union. At the point in which that is true, it's unlikely for these people to be able to pass policy. The policy not being able to pass policy efficiency is uniquely problematic, especially in industries where big industries like education, for example, where having a figure who can't actually fight for within parliament because other people in parliament don't like them, means that just a few weeks of delaying things like exams, for example, is going to hurt so many different people. So this idea of inefficiency of passing policy. That's likely to happen at the point in which you elect an individual who has more support from unions compared to other political figures is uniquely problematic, because this idea of not being able to pass policies fast is going to hurt so many people in the general public. The final thing then I want to add here is the idea that within the union itself, and this is to mitigate how the unions are going to be uniquely problematic, is within the union itself there's going to be a defragmentation. That is to say, because unions aren't elected bodies where there is a clear-cut leader, what's likely to happen is people within that union are going to disagree with who exactly should be vetoed out. At the point in that happening, that's going to cause problems within the union, and it's going to defragment the union, and it's just going to break away the union and reduce the power within the union in the long run, which is again a necessary bad harm that's going to happen. Finally, then ideas on like how trickle-down impacts might be harmful. That is to say, basically, in the long run, if you allow these unions to get more and more power, what's likely to happen is currently it's only going to be one veto vote for them to remove people, but in the long run they might be able to veto out multiple different people in the same election cycle, and finally then they might be the sole benefactor and the sole party that controls who exactly gets voted in within that particular industry, and that like multiplies all the harms that opposition can run in their arguments. So then moving on to like the different types of like clashes that can happen. The first clash that can happen is the principal clash, and proposition best way of mitigating this clash is to say, oh look, unions still need to have a certain say on a principal level because they are the primary actors within this particular industry. And secondly, as I mentioned before, I think the best way of doing so is to make sure you mitigate the harms of the principal just by washing it out and saying, oh look, if we have better practical benefits, the principal doesn't necessarily matter. Opposition, on the other hand, need to make sure that they make an independent path to victory and showcase how, irrespective of the practical harm, the fact still remains that independently on a principle level, being non-democratic is uniquely problematic, and as a whole, irrespective of practical harm, should not happen. Finally, on like the practical clash, I think both sides need to make sure that they showcase as to how giving the unions more power equates to having better change for not only the union and the workers specifically, but also the general public. I think the idea of general public is more important here because they are the vast majority of stakeholders and the most people, because at the end of the day, and as I mentioned before, even the idea of the unions, I think opposition can mitigate this by saying, oh look, any benefit that these unions might get are very top heavy and only the people at the top are likely to get these benefits. So all in all, these are the reasons as to why these are the main clashes that can happen within this debate. So that's about it related to this motion.